Most woodworkers who don't have expensive jointers think they are stuck suffering with warped and twisted wood, which is frustrating to work with, and the results are completely disheartening. So in this video, you'll learn how I flattened hundreds of feet of box store construction lumber before I ever owned a jointer, using tools that you likely already have kicking around in your shop, and I'll prove that each method is indiscernible from the next by building an outdoor dining table. On a typical piece of lumber, you will have two faces and two edges. Ideally, you'd want that first face to be a completely flat plane. You would want that opposite face to be completely parallel to the first face. You want the first edge to be completely straight and square to the faces, and you would want that second edge to be parallel to the first edge. And what do you know? That's the correct order to mill up a piece of wood to be used for furniture. We're gonna start with the faces, but if you're on a time crunch or a lazy kick and wanna do this the speed round way, then you can skip the faces and go straight to the edges later in the video, but the results aren't gonna be as good in the end. If you don't have a jointer or a planer, one of the easiest ways to flatten a board is using a router and a router sled. For the uninitiated, a router sled is basically two parallel rails with this platform that slides across them, carrying your router. Using a flattening bit, it shaves off a very thin layer until you've got a flat surface and a pile of sawdust so massive that your neighbors might think you've adopted a hamster the size of a corgi. Now, the major benefit here is that size is absolutely no limitation. Those massive live edge slabs that are totally still not a fad, yes, this is how the average home hobbyist can flatten one of those. The setup takes about 5 minutes, which largely depends on how quickly and efficiently you can get your workpiece secured and shimmed down to your work surface. I have some handy bench dog clamps to make things fast, but you might have to get thrifty with some double-sided tape or some hot glue, which will take more time. And you also need to make sure that your rails are nice and straight and in the same plane. I've got my router set up to take about 1/16 of an inch off, and any deeper than that, and you're just asking for your router to bog down. Nice. Now, you can use the router sled to also make the opposite face parallel to the first face, but you just need to make sure that your work surface is completely flat and that your rails are parallel to it. And the beauty is that once you got all this set up, you can blast through a bunch of boards fairly fast, and you can also gang several boards together to flatten them all at the same time. This method took me about 5 minutes to flatten this 2x6 on both sides, and this is about 40 inches long. It's not the fastest in the world, but it's definitely not the slowest either. And oh yeah, don't run over the power cord with the router. Overall, this method gets a 2 out of 5 for not being too screw-upable, a 2 out of 5 for costliness because all you need is a decent router and the sled itself, a 3 out of 5 for timeliness, and bonus points for having no size limitations. Okay, hang on. It's Future Scott here, and for some reason I thought it was okay to make this scoring system 1 out of 5 for good and 5 out of 5 for bad. But in hindsight, that seems completely backwards, but we're just gonna call it okay, so keep watching. You can also buy a commercially ready-made router sled, and some of the nice ones feature some neat features like linear bearings for a super smooth action. However, I would struggle recommending one of those before buying something like a planer or a jointer, since you can make one for really cheap and then take your savings to the bank for when you're ready to buy one of those machines. Speaking of machines, I see this all the time when beginners drop $500 on a binder saw and have no budget left for other tools they actually need to get started. Or they buy cheap tools that just frustrate them and hold back their progress. That's why I've created a free tool buyer's guide that breaks down exactly what you need at different budget levels, $1,000, $2,500, and $5,000. So if you're just starting out and wondering what the heck you need to buy for your shop, this guide will save you both money and headaches. So just click the link in the description to download it for free. If all that seems like too much setup and mess for you, well then there's the authentic artisanal option, a hand plane. And nothing says I make my own kombucha quite like spending 4 hours flattening a board that a jointer would do in 30 seconds. But hey, this $30 flea market find makes me feel like a real craftsman when I show it to my wife. All you need is a number 4 or a number 5 plane, a straight edge, and some homemade winding sticks from scrap wood. So the total investment here is minimal. Scrub across the board first all the way down, then at a 45-degree angle all the way down, and then at the opposite 45-degree angle all the way down, and then finally straight across the whole board. You can then use your winding sticks to check for any twist. You can use your straight edge to check for any peaks and valleys. And if you find anything, mark it for attack and then repeat the whole process over again. This method took about 5 minutes for this particular test board because it was already fairly straight, but if yours is a lot more warped, then it can take a lot longer, and that doesn't bode well for our timeliness scale. However, there's nothing quite as romantic as the sound of those wispy shavings drowning out your significant other's pleas to just finish the damn dining table you started 18 months ago. For making the opposite face parallel to the first face, you're gonna need a marking gauge and scribe a line to your desired thickness around the entire perimeter of the board. Then you can take your hand plane and make a chamfer until that line disappears. And then when you're on your opposite face, you can scrub down to that line until that chamfer completely disappears. If you have a power plane, the same principles still apply. You're just gonna be really careful. They remove material very aggressively and it's easy to go way too deep. I once used a power plane to flatten a 24-inch wide, 48-inch long white oak slab. And let me tell you, it was extremely arduous. My arms transformed into what I could only describe as overcooked spaghetti attached to my torso. Overall, this method gets a 5 out of 5 for a high probability that you'll screw it up if you're impatient or have no experience, but a 1 out of 5 for very little tool cost, but a 5 out of 5 for a royal waste of your time. But bonus points for potentially getting super buff. Sticking a warp board straight through your planer is a bit like skipping leg day and just throwing on some yoga pants. I might look athletic, but I'm still misshapen underneath it all. You can, however, use a planer sled, which will cost you the price of a planer if you don't actually own one, but otherwise it's just a scrap piece of melamine. The setup is slightly time consuming, about 2 to 3 minutes per board. You're gonna need a flat piece of melamine. MDF will work too, but it will deteriorate faster. You're also gonna need a way to secure down your warped wood to the sled so it's not gonna move during planing. I like to use hot glue and shims or wedges, and the hot glue holds well enough for the job, but it peels off easily when it's done. And this makes sure that there's no wobble or movement as the whole thing is going through the planer. This method took about 5 minutes total, including setup and planing, which makes it one of the faster options if you've already got a planer. Once you have one face flat, you can flip the board over, remove all the shims, and then just pop this board straight through the planer normally to make the opposite face parallel to the first face. And this is just gonna take another minute and then we'll be done. Overall, this method scores a 1 out of 5 for not being too screw-upable, a 5 out of 5 for costliness if you don't own a planer, but a 1 out of 5 if you do, a 2.5 out of 5 for not being too fast and not too slow, but bonus points for being able to do fairly wide boards faster than a router sled on a machine that would cost an extraordinarily large sum of money for a comparable sized jointer. Let's move on to straightening the edges. For the edges, let's start with a circular saw method. You're gonna need a homemade or store-bought straight edge, a parallel rip jig, and a hope and a prayer. The key with using a straight edge, whether it's store-bought or homemade, is figuring out how to clamp it down securely. I have these track clamps for my regular track saw, and for some reason this Kreg AccuCut doesn't accept regular track clamps. I can't simply just clamp it across it because it'll get in the way of the circular saw running over it. And if the boards are super narrow, then you have nothing to clamp on at all. So I tend to use this with a lot of double-sided tape, which is wasteful and time-consuming. Beyond securing the straight edge down to what you want to cut is securing what you want to cut down to whatever solid you like your workbench and not let the clamps get in the way of the saw's path. And the only way that I figured out how to do this is to either double stick tape this down to a sacrificial board that's double stuck taped down to your workbench, or use a really long clamp to clamp it end to end, which will clear the saw's path. And then what I've done is stuck this clamp into my vise so this is more solid. You're gonna have similar clamping issues on narrow boards with a fancy track saw too, so there's really no advantage there for this specific problem. To make the opposite edge parallel to the first edge, you need to use a rip jig like this one from Kreg, which I do like a little bit better than that weird track straight edge for circular saws. You need to set your desired width right here. Align the fence up with that newly straightened edge to make the opposite edge parallel to the first. Again, the workpiece is difficult to clamp, and the first and last 3 inches tend to be a little rough because of the small reference surface that the jig has at the beginning and at the end of the cut. You can also do this with a track saw and parallel guides, but again, for smaller workpieces, this is very cumbersome and will become inaccurate. This method took about 4 or 5 minutes for both edges on this board. It's pretty quick, but the clamping issues are still pretty frustrating. Overall, this method gets a 5 out of 5 for screw up ability being too damn high, a 1 out of 5 for costliness, since you can likely find a circular saw on the side of the road, a 2 out of 5 for not being too slow, but negative bonus points because that's just how I feel about this. Again, the humble hand plane comes to the rescue. The beauty is that it doesn't have issues with smaller boards. You can easily work on pieces that would be too fiddly to clamp for a circular saw. Use a straight edge to check your progress and that it's actually nice and straight, and then finish up with a square to make sure your edges are in fact square. It's funny how they name these things. You know, nowadays, even though I'll start with my jointer for a straight edge, I'll still make fine adjustments with a hand plane afterwards for more important projects to get that final precision. And as much as I've perfectly calibrated my jointer, for workpieces that are much longer than the jointer beds, there's still room for improvement after the machine that I can get by hand. For the opposite edge, I'm using my marking gauge on both faces and then planing down to those lines, and of course checking for straightness and square just like before. This took about 5 minutes per edge, and again, much like the faces, it really depends on how far off your board initially is, but it is very accurate and you avoid all those clamping headaches that you run into with the circular saw. Overall, this method is still a 5 out of 5 for screw up ability if you haven't gotten the practice under your belt, but it's a 1 out of 5 for costliness again because the tools are rather inexpensive. But it's a 5 out of 5 for still being the slowest way to straighten edges. However, bonus points for being hella accurate once you get it down pat. If you have a table saw, you can use a straight line rip jig to straighten out the first edge. A straight line rip jig is essentially a piece of plywood or MDF or melamine covered particle board, and it has a straight edge on it, and you can clamp your not so straight piece of wood down to it, and with that straight edge up against the fence, you can run it through and you will get a perfectly straight cut from your table saw. After you've got one straight edge established, you can put that first edge up against the rip fence to make the opposite edge parallel to the first. The rip jig combined with the rip fence is by far the fastest method for both edges, and only took about a couple minutes. The only downside to this is that you are limited to the length of the rip jig, which beyond 4 feet might become a little unwieldy, especially on a smaller job site table saw. There's also a method where you clamp a super long straight piece of wood to your table saw fence, and that can work as well, but it needs to be twice the length of the workpiece you want to straighten for it to be effective. So again, beyond 4 feet long, it's going to be really unwieldy. And it also becomes moot if you can't actually straighten a piece that's twice as long as your workpiece. You can also use an L fence, which I won't go into too much detail here because I threw mine away, but it's still a valid option. I just prefer this rip jig because I think it's a bit faster once you have it made. Overall, this method gets a 1 out of 5 for not being too screw upable, a 1 out of 5 for cost if you already own a table saw, but I suppose a 5 out of 5 for cost if you don't own one, a 1 out of 5 for being pretty fast with only a real jointer being faster. However, negative bonus points for having a limit of about 2 inches thick material if your rip jig uses a 3/4 inch base, but I don't really think you'll encounter this issue too much. You can turn your router table into a jointer. A very tiny jointer, just wide enough to straighten the first edge, but it only works if you can offset the outfeed side of the fence. There are DIY router fence options that feature this, but likely if you have a commercially available router table of this caliber, then you probably have a jointer anyways, but I suppose it's worth mentioning. With an offset fence where the outfeed side is aligned with the bit, but the infeed side is back slightly, you can pass the edge over the router bit, and this will work exactly like a small jointer would work. After getting one edge straight, you'd still have to go back to another method to get the other edge parallel to the first, like using the rip fence on the table saw. Once this method is set up, it's just as fast as a real jointer, but since the fence is so short, you can't really straighten much beyond a couple of feet. Overall, this method gets a 3 out of 5 for screw up ability, since even a medium length board mightn't come out very straight and setup can be finicky. A 5 out of 5 for cost, as a commercially available router table with this feature are gonna be expensive, but a 1 out of 5 for being nearly as fast as a jointer. But negative bonus points, as you will still need a table saw after this, so you may as well just use the straight line rip jig on that. So here's the finished dining table using all the different methods that I showed you in this video for how to straighten construction lumber. But yeah, do you think there's anything different about any of these boards? The point is that you don't need an expensive jointer to work with lumber that's not already straight. With a little patience and some tools that you probably already have, you can make quality furniture that will last for years. If you need an easy and inexpensive workbench to build without a jointer or planer, then check out this video right here. And don't forget about the free tools buyer's guide by checking out the link in the description. Nugget? Take it.